Hi, everyone. As you join, please use the chat box and let us know where you're joining us from. If you're from Florida, if you're from outside of Florida, or even outside the United States, please let us know, and we'll get started here in just a few minutes. Hi, Heather from Florida, and Linda, also from Florida. Thank you guys for joining us today. Okay, we have somebody from Macon, Georgia, and then we have somebody from Mount Pleasant, Ontario. Hello, how are you guys? Judy Gardner. All right, and we'll get started here in just a few minutes, like I said. Let a few more people join. Hello, George from Florida. Good to see you. All right, so as people are joining, I am going to go ahead and give a little introduction. This is for our program and for the Marine Station itself. So I want to welcome everybody. My name is Erin Lomax, and I'm a marine science educator at the Smithsonian Marine Ecosystems exhibit at the St. Lucie County Aquarium in Fort Pierce, Florida. And welcome to our Marine Science in the Morning lecture series. This series highlights current marine science research presented by the researchers themselves. And this year we're featuring women in STEM. STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This is an annual winter/spring speaker series at the Smithsonian Marine Ecosystems exhibit. And normally this is an in-person program, but this year it's going to be on a virtual platform. And if you'd like more information about upcoming programs and registration for those programs, I encourage you to check out our Facebook events page. That's located at facebook.com/SmithsonianSMS. And we will be putting that link in our chat for you as well. And again, as you're coming in, just let us know where you're tuning in from. And as we do that, I want to point out some of the features. So at the bottom of your screen, you're going to see a Q&A button. It has 2 speech bubbles, and that's where you can write your questions for our presenter. You can submit a question at any time, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can by the end of our program. There is another educator that's on in the background to help keep track of your questions. So if you see a message in the chat box, it will be coming from Jamil Wilson. He is our digital programming intern. And throughout the program, you can also use that chat box to send us any messages or answer any questions we have for you. And just as a reminder, your comments are visible only to Smithsonian staff, so please try to keep your comments on topic and appropriate. And another reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to find a copy of it both on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. And Jamil will be putting some links for our YouTube channel in the chat box as well. So today's program will run about 40 to 45 minutes with about 15 minutes of questions at the end. We're going to aim for wrapping up right around noon today. So hello, Mia and James from Maryland, and Mimi from Ventura, California. It's probably kind of early out there today. I don't know, or right now. All right. So it's just about time. So I am going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Just another reminder, anytime you have a question for our speaker, just make sure you're putting it in the Q&A box. The Q&A button is at the bottom of your screen and has 2 speech bubbles. So go ahead and put your questions in there, and you can submit those at any time. All right, well, it is my pleasure this morning to introduce Dr. Loraé Simpson. She was actually a tech at the Smithsonian Marine Station for 9 years. And some of the work that she's presenting today was research done while she was at the Smithsonian Marine Station. She earned her PhD at the University of Florida in soil and water science. And she's currently the director of research and conservation at Florida Oceanographic Society in Stuart, Florida. And this morning, she's going to be talking a little bit about migration of mangroves into northern Florida. All right, Loraé, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And then at the end, we'll just do a little Q&A, okay?
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, the floor is yours.
All right, good morning, everyone. It's so great to see so many people from across the United States and even in Canada joining us today, not only from classrooms and from their living rooms. This is awesome. I'm truly honored and humbled to be able to share this morning with you and to tell you this natural history story that's really near and dear to my heart. As mentioned, I worked at the Smithsonian Marine Station for many years, and so a lot of this research that I'm going to present today was done in collaboration with Smithsonian researchers, as well as researchers throughout the country and throughout the world. And so the talk that I'm going to give is going to be essentially a mix of mangrove natural history, weaved or woven, pardon me, in with the work that we have done over the last decade or so. But to begin to tell the stories about the mangroves on the move and how this mangrove migration is taking place, I thought it would be best to just start with a little bit of basic mangrove ecology, Mangrove 101. So what makes a mangrove? Many of you here in Florida are pretty familiar with these ubiquitous trees along the Indian River Lagoon or any other brackish waterway here in Florida. And you can probably easily point out the red mangroves with their, let's see, our little, here we go. Here's our red mangrove with our prop roots. So these big prop roots that kind of extend out into the waterways. Then you have your black mangroves that you can probably tell from their dark black bark as they get older. And then there's the white mangroves, which to me, their leaves are much brighter, a little bit more oval. And the term mangrove actually does not refer to a specific taxonomic group of species, but to a myriad of species. So it's any species that is haplophytic, so that it can grow in inundated saline soils. And so that means that there's not just mangrove trees, but there's actually mangrove ferns, mangrove palms, mangrove vines. There's even a mangrove hibiscus tree. And so in order for a plant to become or to be a mangrove, it has to fall under a few different categories. And so the categories are pretty simplistic and straightforward, but one of them is that these mangroves occur only in the mangrove environment and does not extend into a terrestrial community. So what does that mean? That essentially means that these mangroves live along the water in this inundated environment and will not be up in the higher tidal prism where you might see a palm or a pine tree. And because of that, there's a very specific zonation that these plants can live in. And the reason they can live in there is because they have morphological specializations or adaptations to that environment. One of these adaptations are these aerial roots. So the red mangroves right here, they have these prop roots. The black mangroves have pneumatophores. And these aerial roots, what they do is they allow the tree to breathe when it's underwater. So just like you and I, if we were held underwater, we would not be able to breathe and we would drown. Well, these trees will do the same thing. When they're inundated with the tides, the below ground roots are unable to breathe. So it's these aerial roots that pull air down into the sediment, down into the root structure below, that allow the plant to breathe during tidal inundation. Another morphological specialization that they have is that of vivipary, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's essentially the fact that these plants kind of give forth to live birth. So the second propagule falls off the tree, that little seed pod or propagule has already germinated and is a living plant. Another quote thing that makes a mangrove is physiological mechanism for salt exclusion or excretion. So many plants, you and I, we can't drink salt water. If we drink salt water, it will dehydrate us and eventually kill us. Mangroves have adapted to, number one, either take salt water in, but then excrete salt out of its leaves. So if you turn over a black mangrove leaf, there'll be a bunch of salt crystals on the back, and that's what it's doing. It's shedding that salt so it doesn't dehydrate the plants. The black or the red mangrove actually doesn't even allow salt to come in through its aerial roots, so it stops that salt, and that allows it to live in these brackish waterways. Mangroves can actually live in freshwater, and they have no problem doing so because they don't like salt just like you and I. The reason that we don't see mangroves in freshwater as much as we see it in saltwater is due to competition. So a lot of plants can't live in saltwater, and that's why mangroves are so ubiquitous in these waterways. But if you went to, let's say, the Loxahatchee River, which is almost freshwater, there's mangroves all the way up there, and that's just because they've had the chance to outcompete any of the species that were on that waterway. And then the last thing is that there's taxonomic isolation from its terrestrial relatives. And that just means that during evolution, there is no actual relationship between the terrestrial relatives, whether that's a pine tree or a palm tree, with a mangrove species. So what this comes down to is that mangroves are actually found all over the world. There's 73 species and recognized hybrids, and they're found in about 123 different countries. But I think most of them, I think almost like 75% of them are found in just 15 countries around the world. So this is a world map, and the dark black lines here, that's where you have mangrove species. And then the grayish lines, that's where you have salt marsh. And so you can see that salt marsh and mangroves, they are in the same niche with one another. And where you have mangroves, you don't necessarily have salt marsh, and vice versa. And the reason that is because mangroves are kept around 30 degrees north, top line, and 30 degrees south due to freezing temperatures. Mangroves do not like it when it gets cold. If you have several days of freezing temperatures, they will effectively knock back the mangroves and they will die, and then the salt marsh can move in. Salt marsh, they don't mind the freezing temperatures, right? They die back during the winter time, and that's why you find these salt marshes in areas where it's cold year-round or during the winter time. And so as you can see, there's a very narrow niche that these species live in. Here in the United States, we actually have mangroves in Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. So these black pixelated boxes, this is where we have current mangroves presence here in Florida, a little bit here in the boot of Louisiana, and a few isolated pockets in Texas. And where you see the white pixelated boxes, this is where the niche is available for mangroves, but salt marsh is filling that niche. And so over time, we're seeing that warmer winters are leading to mangrove ridge expansion and salt marsh replacement. So these areas where it's currently salt marsh could one day potentially be mangrove forest. And so we could see mangroves pop up in Alabama and the Gulf Shores, as well as Mississippi and even up to Georgia if they're not already there. But if we just focus in on Florida for a little bit, Florida has a really amazing dynamic system when it comes to mangroves. At the southern end of the state, from just around Sebastian and south, you have pure mangrove stands along the coast. And we have all three species, the red, the black, and the white. And these are tall, fringing, very productive mangrove systems. As you move north, these mangrove systems are now at the northernmost range of their distribution. So they're not as tall anymore. And they start to integrate with salt marsh species, which are now at the southernmost range of their distribution. So this is black mangroves here integrated with some salt marsh species in Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. And as you proceed up more north, a little around the Jacksonville area, this is where you have pure salt marsh stands. So you look out and there's just this beautiful salt marsh pan and no mangroves in sight. Well, back in probably 2010, people started to notice that mangroves were migrating north. When they would look out into the salt marsh, they would be a mangrove tree. And so a researcher, he used some satellite data to show that mangrove area and extent was in fact increasing along the Atlantic coast. And so from about Fort Pierce, where Smithsonian Marine Station is, up to St. Augustine, Dr. Kavanaugh was able to show that mangrove area and extent had increased from 20% to 120%, depending on the area. And so when you would go up to St. Augustine now, you would look out into the salt marsh and see mangroves dotting that landscape. Not only did we see this just in the satellite imagery, but we were seeing this right in front of our eyes. During this time when Dr. Kavanaugh came out with this paper, we decided to put in some permanent plots along the coast. And the idea is we would put in these PVC poles, and be able to go back over time and watch how this ecosystem was being changed. And so we put in permanent plots in the salt marsh, and then we put in some permanent plots here on the backside where there's salt marsh and mangroves. And in 2015, this is completely salt marsh. This is a succulent salt marsh plant. In 2018, we went back to do another study. We wanted to look at decomposition in this salt marsh plots. Well, when we went back, lo and behold, in 3 years, there were 252 shrubs that had established, which is a 168% increase in above ground biomass, which no one was expecting. You know, we see it in satellite data, but to see it right in front of us had big questions and a lot of implications that came in with, if we're changing species, what is that doing to the ecosystem? But this is actually proven to be a very dynamic process that's not just taking place in this snapshot of time that we're focusing on. So just for a minute, let's focus our eyes into this area up in St. Augustine. So here's the Matanzas Inlet. Down here, this is the Matanzas Fort. Marineland is to the south. St. Augustine is the north. If you look at this little spit of land right here, we do a lot of work in this little spit, and you can watch this little lake right here in the middle. Researcher, Dr. Rodriguez, he went through and he compiled historical aerial photography from 1942 to 1980. And that photography, he was able to denote where the mangroves were. So this is the green, the salt marsh, which is the yellow, and then the unvegetated, this is actually the water around that little spit of land. So this is that lake that I was drawing your attention to. And you can see that over this span of time, there has been an increase and decrease of mangrove cover. So in 1942, there wasn't a lot. Then we had a huge explosion in 52. And then by 1980, it had almost gone. He also used multispectral high resolution satellite imagery to do the same thing, to show between 1995 and 2013 that once again, you have this oscillation of habitats on this little spit of land. And so not only is this happening just here in that spit, but this was happening all over the coast of Florida. And so you take this data that he pulled from pictures and from satellite data, we can graph it. Here on this graph, you have total area, so how much area each of these species contained on the spit. And mangroves are in the solid black line, salt marsh is the dotted line, and this is time, so 1942 to 2012. And as you can see, as mangrove cover increases, salt marsh decreases. And this is essentially you're having this competition is taking over. So if there's more mangroves, you're going to have less salt marsh due to just land availability. And what was driving this though? If we go back, and I've mentioned about mangroves don't like it when it's really cold. If you dig around in the citrus literature, they did a really wonderful job at documenting impact freezes. So an impact freeze is when all of the citrus died. And obviously it was a big deal for commercial ventures in Florida. So there was a lot of detail that was put in to understanding or watching these impact freezes. So from that, we were able to pull that there were several impact freezes over the span of time that killed back all the Florida citrus. So if it killed back the Florida citrus, it also killed back the mangroves. So in 1942 or 1940, we had a big one. We had several between the 50s and the 60s, and then a bunch of them in the 1980s. And so you can see, once again, as these mangroves declined, this is when salt marsh increased in the area. But then, why are we seeing these steep increases? Here we have this one big one around 1844. Then we have another one around this 2002. To understand what's happening there, we need to go back to the life history of mangroves once again. So let's talk about that vivipary that I talked about a little bit earlier. Mangroves don't have seeds, they have propagules. And I'm sure that you know the red mangroves. A lot of people denote them as looking like string beans. Then we have the black mangrove propagule, which kind of looks like a big lima bean. And the white mangrove is a little harder to find because once it falls off the tree, it turns brown very quickly, but it looks like a sunflower seed. And what these are, they're maternal reserves. So there's a bunch of energy that is stored in these propagules. The second that the propagule falls off of the parent plant, it starts to germinate. So it starts to put out roots. And the idea being that if you have a bunch of propagules fall beneath your parent tree, you don't really want your offspring to be there because you're going to be competing for light. And so ideally, your propagule would fall into the water and float away and find more suitable substrate or more suitable habitat to actually put down roots and establish. And so because of that, the size of these propagules denotes how much energy is in them and how long these propagules can actually float for. So red mangroves can float up to 1 year and still put out roots and still be stranded and established just fine. Black mangroves can float up to 3 months and still be viable. And white mangroves, the smallest of the three, can float up to 3 weeks and be viable. So they have potential for long distance dispersal because of this mechanism of vivipary. Now, propagules fall from the trees between September and January. And if we were in the room right now, I would ask all the Floridians, what also happens between September and January in Florida? And now it seemed like it was getting pushed back a little bit farther this year too. Usually they end around November. Yes, hurricanes. So if you go back to this map and you overlay when we had hurricanes, lo and behold, it was right before you saw the steep increase in mangrove area and extent. So right here, this is the 1944 Cuba, Florida hurricane. And then down here, we have the 2004 active hurricane season, which many of you in this area may remember Hurricane Jean and Francis. And what this does is these hurricanes come through with their high winds. They knock all the propagules off the tree. And then through the pushing of waves through wind, as well as high tidal surges, you're able to get propagules into places that they wouldn't be before. And so you think about, if you look at these pictures over here, why were there propagules or mangroves that showed up in the middle of this and not on the edges? That's likely due to high water events that push mangroves farther than they would have been able to get in any other capacity. And so the persistence of these mangroves really depends on the potential of its propagules to disperse over long distances. And this long distance dispersal is actually really, really important and very well utilized. So just to drive this home though, back in 2014, we did some beach walks. So we went out to beaches along the Atlantic coast. This is the latitude, this is around Fort Pierce. And then we proceeded up to St. Augustine around 30 degrees. Here's propagules per meter squared. And what we did is we just walked along these rack lines. This is sargassum that washes up. And this sargassum will wash up with other things too. It will capture propagules, it captures trash. But this is a really good metric for understanding what is out in that water and what gets washed on to shore. And so in 2014, we did that walk. We did several of them, long transects along these beaches. And you can see that there is about 1 propagule per meter squared when we were doing those. Well, then a hurricane hit in 2017. Obviously, that was very stressful for our personal lives, but also very exciting for this hypothesis that we were trying to test. So we ran out right after Hurricane Irma and did those same walks in the same places. And it's probably difficult to see here, but in these little circles, there are black mangrove propagules. And so what we found was a huge increase in mangrove propagule recruitment along these beaches, which just suggests to us that those propagules had made it out of an inlet and had been pushed up into places that they weren't usually used to getting to. And so while we're out doing these propagule walks, we also collected them. And when we got back to the lab, we handed them off to a quantitative geneticist. And what he did was he used population genetics to look at the dispersal distance for these mangroves that we had picked up. And what he found was that this right here is the Matanzas Inlet. He found propagules in the Matanzas Inlet up by St. Augustine that were from Cedar Key. He found some that were from the Everglades and Sebastian Inlet, Ponce Inlet. So some of these propagules had made a trek of 620 miles just due to that hurricane, which is just fascinating when you think about something so small and that it's able to make it around the coast of Florida, help perpetuate its population and increase the genetic diversity of the species. At the same time, when he was doing that, he took his sample that he needed and we took all the propagules back and we planted them all. There was 100% viability of every single propagule that made it into these coasts or into these inlets. And so this propagule or propagules that made it from Cedar Key were 100% viable. And it just is beautiful to know that what they're doing. Mangroves can get there. Now, just to hit home the fact that this expansion is a very dynamic system, you know, we've seen the satellite data that has shown that these mangroves have been here back in the early 1900s. A researcher, Dr. Kavanagh, he used a model to model minimum temperatures to see how suitable the Atlantic coast was for, or I guess the St. Augustine area, how suitable that was for mangrove expansion. And so what he did, if you focus your eye on this black line is just minimum temperatures over those years. Then the model predicted that if that black line was above 0.5, it would be suitable for mangroves. If the temperature was below 0.5, it was suitable for salt marsh. And so we have this idea, you know, the model is suggesting that this is what should have been done, or what we should have been seeing. At the same time, Dr. Candy Feller, a Smithsonian researcher, she started digging through old maps, old sailing charts, journals, Jonathan Dickinson's diary, beekeeping newsletters, citrus reports, the photo archives of the state of Florida. And she was able to match up eyewitness accounts of either mangrove or salt marsh dominance that aligns with these certain times. So if you see the green bar, that means there's eyewitness accounts of mangroves being the dominant species, while this pink line is evidence of actual salt marsh being the dominant species. So there's a lot of words to take away from this, but I'll just pull a few of them for you, which were really cool. There was one paper that was actually on manatees, and it noted that after the winter of 1894, there was a huge freeze, and nearly every mangrove tree along the Indian River was killed to the ground. There was another paper from Beekeeping Journal that was talking about the fact, maybe I should preface this, but back in the early 1900s, beekeeping for Avicennia germanis honey, or the black mangrove honey, was a very important source of honey in the state of Florida. And so the Beekeeping Journal noted that there were reports of how freezes destroyed entire stands of their honey-producing trees. And they eventually just stopped working with mangrove honey because they weren't sure when the next freeze would come. William Bartrand made mention of them in 1766 on Anastasia Island. And even John Muir was out here, and he wrote about them in the 1800s being in Fernandina Beach, which is all the way up in the St. Augustine area. So it's just so fascinating to find these snippets of mangrove ecology in places that, as a mangrove ecologist, you might not be looking for. This is just some pictures from the state archives that I found very interesting. These are pictures taken at the base of Fort Matanzas between 1900 and 2018. And you can see these are, you know, family photos or postcards. And right now you can see that there's no mangroves during this 1905 to 1908 time period. By 1916 or 1927, there's mangroves all at the base. 1964, there's some mangroves. If you flip around to the backside of the fort, you can look out here and see there are no mangroves. It's all salt marsh. But then now, if you look out, there are huge mangrove trees dotting the landscape. And so you can see that these mangroves and salt marshes, while we're seeing this happen right now in front of us, we're seeing this switch in ecosystems, this has actually been going back and forth for a while now. And this is mainly due to the decrease in warmer winter, or an increase in warmer winters. And so there's one other thing, though, that has changed recently within our time period, which really is going to dictate how we see the oscillation of these habitats shifting, and that's of coastal eutrophication. So 65% of our U.S. estuaries and coastal water bodies are moderately to severely degraded by excessive nutrient inputs. And many of us down here in South Florida are intimately aware of the amount of nutrients that make it into our coastal waterways. And so, you know, whether it's pollution or septic tanks or agricultural runoff, all that nutrient load makes it into our waterways along the coast. Well, what lives there on the coast? Mangroves and salt marsh. So we know that, you know, just from giving nutrients to our houseplants, that a certain level of nutrients could be good for growth, especially if it's a limiting nutrient. So we wanted to test what a limiting nutrient would do to mangrove growth at the northernmost range of distribution. How would this help these plants or hinder these plants as they're moving north due to a decrease in or an increase in winter temperatures? And so let's focus our minds back on that little spit of land that we talked about earlier. This is the site that we did some satellite work with. And in 2012, we set up a fertilization experiment. This is what those mangroves look like up there. This guy is about 6 foot, and you can see these black mangroves are very short and scrubby. It's integrated with some succulent saltmarsh species in here. And so what we did was we fertilized some with nitrogen, we fertilized some with phosphorus, and then we left some just by themselves, left them alone, and those acted as the control. And so we were curious, if these plants get a limiting nutrient, how will they respond? So back in 2012, we took our height data, and you can see that the control, the nitrogen trees, and the phosphorus trees, they were all the exact same height. Well, 4 years later, you can see that the control and the phosphorus are still at the same height as one another. So phosphorus is not the limiting nutrient, but the nitrogen tree has grown 24 centimeters more than the control and the phosphorus trees. So these trees in this location are definitely nitrogen limited. And I think it's interesting to look at the pictures when you see this. So at each tree, we put a PVC pole in. It's about maybe 3 feet high. This is the PVC pole at the control tree. Here's the PVC pole at the phosphorus tree. And then here it is at the nitrogen tree, where the tree is basically engulfed with an entire PVC pole. And so not only are these trees getting taller, but they're also getting wider. So the area covered by each tree is increasing. Here are your control trees and your phosphorus trees. There's no difference in 2014 and 2018. But here, the nitrogen tree increased by a lot. And what that means is those saltmarsh species that were living under it now are going to be outcompeted for light. And this is how we see that competition in play. And this is why mangrove area is increasing, but saltmarsh is decreasing due to that competition of the limiting light. Now, just as we are so proud of ourselves, we have shown that these mangroves are moving north, nutrients are helping to spread these mangroves, quote unquote disaster hit. So in January of 2018, we had a cold freeze. There were 3 nights where there were several hours when it was below freezing. And so part of us were crying because there went all of our work, but at the same time, part of us were like happy because this is what we've been studying. And if you look at some of these pictures, you can see these canopies are just completely brown. Total death, especially up here. These are just little guys that we're not going to stand a chance. Here's a nice big one that's all brown. So the leaves are just brown and crispy. So we ran out there right away, and we did a quick count of the proportion of the canopy, so the leaves that were brown. So how much of that canopy had died. When we looked at the control, there was about 60 to 70% death in that canopy. When we looked at the phosphorus, there was just around 80% of canopy death. But when we looked at the nitrogen, there was just under 10% mortality in these trees. And so what was happening was, as these trees got bigger and wider, they were able to keep or buffer the winds from them. So a bigger canopy means they were able to keep a warmer climate within the canopy branches, whereas these smaller trees, they didn't have anything to buffer them from winds. And so because of that, these nitrogen trees that were much bigger survived that cold snap much more than the control and the phosphorus. But then something also weird happens. So every year when we go out, we do our area cover, we do our height. We would also measure shoot elongation of these trees. And this is the difference in leaf internode. So every year it puts out another set of leaves, and you can count or you can measure how big that internode is. And if there's a limiting nutrient that it's receiving, it'll probably be a bigger internode. If it's time of stress, a smaller internode. And so what you can see starting here in 2014, you have nitrogen always has much more internode length, so more shoot elongation, whereas the control and the phosphorus are significantly lower than those. Well, the freeze happens right here where this blue line is. The next year when we went out to check on that shoot elongation, there was a huge uptick in all 3 of the trees, which was a little perplexing for a bit. And then it struck us. All those dead leaves that were on the canopy, they eventually fell off. And when they fell off with all the nutrients that were in them, all the carbon, all the nitrogen, all the phosphorus. all those nutrients that are necessary for growth. And so when that happened and they fell to the base of their parent plant, those leaves actually acted as a nutrient subsidy and helped those plants repair the damage that had happened from that freezing stress. And so when we went back, you can see that there was no longer that nutrient subsidy from the leaves, and the growth had kind of gone back to what it was pre-freeze. And so it was just a very beautiful cyclical cycle of these plants that were not only encroaching, but kind of repairing themselves of the damage that had happened. Now, before I go on, I do want to note, though, that I've mentioned a lot about how nutrients are helping these mangroves move north, but I do want to remind everyone that nutrient enrichment is not always a bad thing, especially over long periods of time. You know, we give our houseplants a little bit of fertilizer to help it grow, but if we give it a lot, things start to get wonky. And what happens if you eutrophie a plant is that it shifts its biomass allocation. And so plants are always looking for nutrients in the soil. If they don't need to look for those nutrients, they don't put as much effort into making roots. And instead, they put all their effort into their above ground biomass. So now the biomass ratio is out of whack. And that's a bad thing when we're talking in terms of stressors. So this paper right here, Nutrient Enrichment Increases Mortality of Mangroves, showed that nutrient-enriched or nitrogen-enriched mangrove trees, when in a time of drought, they all died back. And that was because there was a drought and they didn't have enough roots to pull water up into its canopy. And in doing so, effectively killed out that population. Another paper that looked at something very similar was one done in Avalon State Park here in Fort Pierce. And this is a series of pictures looking into the canopy. So the camera is facing up, so you're looking up into the branches. And this is right after Hurricane Jean and Francis. And you can see that all the leaves have been taken off the trees here, completely defoliated. There was trees that were nitrogen enriched, and those trees that were nitrogen enriched took 4 years to recover compared to the only 2 years that it took the controls. And so there's just so much more biomass and not enough roots to help that tree get back to where it was in a quick, timely manner, which could be a 1-2 punch if another stressor came in right behind that. And so to wrap all this up together, these expansions that we're seeing right now is a very dynamic process. But what we're seeing right now is that decrease in the intensity, duration, and frequency of winter climate extremes coupled with hurricanes is increasing mangrove encroachment into salt marsh. And this is also proven to be aided by nutrient enrichment in these systems. And so what this is leading to is alterations in the species structure and productivity. And that leads to shifts in ecosystem service provisioning. So what does this all mean? Is this encroachment a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Should we be concerned? Well, both salt marshes and mangroves, they perform the same ecosystem services. Remember, they live in that same niche, that very narrow area of land along the coast. The main differences is the mangroves are kept between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. But wherever they are all doing the same thing. They're biogeochemically cycling. They are acting as habitat for species. There's a lot of biological productivity, which is aiding in the flow of energy and connectivity between habitats. And so for us, that means that the ecosystem services they are providing is recreation, erosion control of our shorelines, carbon storage, storm protection of our shorelines, pollution control of the water that makes its way from upland out into the coastal waters, habitat for commercially important species. So since they all offer these same ecosystem services, it's the structure that dictates the magnitude of that function. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at these two habitats. This is a picture of the Stickleous Marsh and Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. And this is a beautiful grass that dies back yearly, every winter. And then here is a red mangrove forest in St. Lucie Inlet State Park. And these are tall, fringing mangroves. They are long-lived, woody. You can see that there's a person actually back here. Like, that's how tall these trees are. And so the structure is really going to dictate how they're able to perform the ecosystem services. So let's go through a few examples of comparing and contrasting salt marsh and mangroves. One of the ecosystem services is storm protection. So if you think about a storm with a big tidal surge that moves through a landmass, think about the fact that it could go right over the top of that deciduous marsh. But if it hits that mangrove area in St. Lucie Inlet, those tangle of roots and trees and limbs, that's really going to dissipate the energy that tidal surge can move over that land. And so a researcher did a study in Merritt Island, and she was able to show that it takes 17.5 meters or 55 feet to attenuate 90% of the wave height in a saltmarsh habitat, whereas it only takes 5 feet to attenuate that same amount in a mangrove habitat. And so mangroves can attenuate those waves or slow those waves down over a distance 10 times smaller than the salt marsh. And that's protecting whatever is behind that area, right? Another thing that happens is as these waves move through this area, once the winds die down and the water recedes, because it's kicked up a bunch of sediment and a bunch of land as it's moved through, it's kind of scoured it due to the waves and the winds, that exits that system as well. When the waves recede, it takes with it all of that sediment. And so because the mangroves slow down those waves so much more, it also acts to prevent that erosion that would be much higher in the salt marsh habitat. So erosion prevention was 470% higher in the mangrove habitat and then in the salt marsh habitat. Another important ecosystem service that both of these ecosystems provide, and we probably don't think about very often, is that of carbon storage. So we have CO2 in our atmosphere, and plants, what they do is they sequester carbon in their biomass. So what they do is they pull that CO2 from the air through photosynthesis, and they store it in their leaves, their woods, their branches, and their trunks. And so it's locked in there. It's not back in the atmosphere. So the more green you have, whether it's a mangrove forest or a rainforest, the more carbon that is locked up in these trees. Well, over time, these leaves, branches, trees, they may die back, and that biomass will fall into the water right down here. This is a very anoxic environment, or there's not a lot of oxygen. And so because of that, decomposition doesn't happen as quickly or at all as it would in other environments, like an upland terrestrial environment. And so since that biomass isn't being exported out of the system, it ends up just sitting here, and the carbon is then stored in that soil unless something changed and oxygen was added to that system. And so because you're having biomass that's falling down and being stored, more biomass goes on top of that, and on top of that, and on top of that. And over time, you'll actually have an increase in vertical accretion in these systems because those leaves or those sediments aren't broken down and exported. And so you can go to places like Belize where these mangrove islands, they sit on 20 to 40 feet of peat, and they will be left there undisturbed for millennia as long as we don't change the land use function. And so in terms of mangroves and salt marshes, it was found here along the Atlantic coast of Florida, there's 32% more carbon in mangrove above ground biomass than in salt marsh. So there's more carbon that these trees take in and can hold for a longer period of time because these trees do not die back in the wintertime like salt marsh does, and because they're just bigger, they're woodier. And so let's go back to that one plot that we talked about earlier, the salt marsh plot back here in 2015. Well, by 2018, once again, there were 252 individuals that popped up in just 3 years. So in terms of carbon, that meant there was a 68% increase in total carbon stock between 2015 and 2018. You can see there was an increase in carbon in the soil, there was an increase in carbon in this below ground biomass, and an increase in carbon in the above ground biomass. And once again, this is driven mainly by the fact that there's just more structure to perpetuate that function. And so when we're talking about this expansion, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We're seeing that as these mangroves move north, there's increased carbon storage, there's increased erosion prevention, there's increased storm protection. We also see sea level rise mitigation because as that land grows up taller, now we're be able to buffer ourselves from the increasing sea level. And there's multiple other ecosystem functions that we can talk about and that we're not going to get into today. whether it's water quality, nutrient cycling, fish or habitat provisioning. But if we can take anything home from today, it would be that number one, along the Atlantic coast of Florida here, this mangrove expansion is a dynamic process, and it results in several positive feedbacks to global climate change. And there's much more work that can be done to understand this new ecosystem state, because while we know it's been very dynamic and it oscillates, this might be something new that moving into the future. And so with that, I really need to acknowledge everybody that helped, all the collaborators in this talk that I mentioned their work. I'm sure I'm missing so many people, but I really want to give a very special thanks to Dr. Candy Feller. The story that I told today was really her vision and her story, and I was just so blessed to be part of that journey with her, and obviously to be part of that journey at the Smithsonian. We have several funding partners as well as many collaborators across Florida State Parks and other organizations that made all of this work possible. I am excited to answer any questions that you guys may have. And if for some reason a question pops up later, or you just don't want to ask your question now, please feel free to write down my email address and shoot me an email at your convenience. So with that, I am done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Loraé. We do have some really good questions from the audience. So let me go ahead and ask the first one here. So let me see here. Lynn is asking, have you found a correlation between changes in, sounds like biodiversity in the water surrounding Florida and changes in that mangrove area? So have you guys done any studies on the biodiversity? Is that changing as well?
So that's a great question, Lynn. We have done some studies looking at, obviously, as mangroves move north, does that changing like the benthic population with it? So we know that certain crabs live in saltmarsh, but other crabs live in mangroves, or certain shrimp. And yes, as the mangroves move north, they take with them those critters that are found down here in South Florida. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing because they're performing the same function, but we are seeing shifts in the species and the diversity as they move north.
Okay, all right. And then Sarah is asking about the salt content of those salt marshes that you're starting to find mangroves in. Does that salt content impact or inhibit any of the mangrove growth that you've seen?
That's a wonderful question. So as mentioned, mangroves are pretty good with dealing with salt, and mangroves and salt marsh, they kind of, since they live in the same area, they're used to the same salt content, whether it's 32 to 37 parts per thousand. There are places that I've been where maybe it's a very dry environment and the salt content has been between 60 parts per thousand and 100 parts per thousand, and mangroves are doing fine. They're a little bit more stunted, but here in Florida, they're just fine moving into wherever that salt marsh plant is. Great question.
Okay. All right, great. Now we had several questions come through concerning things like pollution or the human impact on Florida, and if this is directly impacting seeing these mangroves moving north. So can you talk a little bit about that? Have you guys found if there is a correlation between human pollution and what you guys are seeing in northern Florida?
Great questions. We have not gotten to the point where we can definitely correlate them with one another, but that's definitely a line of research that I'm planning on moving into, especially in the area that we're in. There are some metrics that we can use to show how eutrophied a tree is. Even though it looks fine, it might not necessarily be fine. And I think that's definitely an important conversation that needs to be had. So great question, and tune in hopefully in a few years from now when I have that data set.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's almost like it's a little bit of a gray area, right? And it's it's kind of the same thing with some of the invasives that we see in Florida. They impact these ecosystems, but they might have certain benefits as well. So for some of these species, it does become, do we just leave them there because the wildlife in that area has come to depend on those invasives? Do we take them out? What's the impact of that? So it's interesting to see that we're having that same discussion about a native species in Florida. We don't see it that far north normally. So that's interesting.
And I think it's weird for people that may have grown up in northern Florida and they've never seen a mangrove out there, and now there's a tree and it's right in front of their property line, and they're like, wait, what's happening? And
Right.
so I think, we just have to learn to live in harmony and know that it's doing the same function as a salt marsh. And, there's still going to be the beautiful birds and you can still go fishing, but we just have to get used to it.
Right, right. And I have to admit, I'm not sure what the effectiveness is of mangroves on shoreline erosion and salt marshes effects on shoreline erosion. I don't know if one is better than the other. Can you just speak to that at all? I mean, what's better for shoreline erosion, mangroves or salt marshes?
So mangroves have kind of been shown to be better for the shoreline erosion just because they have a bigger below ground net, especially those red mangroves. And the pneumatophores, the black mangroves, they hold on to sediment a lot better than a salt marsh does, especially the fact that these salt marsh, they die back in the wintertime. So when they're dead, they're not really holding on to anything. Obviously, the below ground component is still there. That's still alive in these salt marshes. But it's a very spatial and temporal conversation in terms of shoreline erosion. Great question.
Yeah, so I guess sort of related to that, we had somebody ask, would there ever be a circumstance that you would be purposely seeding mangrove seeds in these areas to prevent erosion? And would it be conductive to their growth? I know you said those mangroves up north, they're a little stunted. We don't tend to get really huge mangroves in Florida anyway. We see that more and more, tropical, just straight up tropical places. But do you guys have any plans for anything like that for seeding those?
There's a lot of areas, well, even down south here, there could be some sort of mangrove die-off that has taken place. And we seed mangroves often. So you just get the propagules and just throw them out there and they'll take care of themselves. There was a big project that just happened in the Bahamas. There was a big dieback of mangroves after a hurricane, and they flew over the top of it and pushed propagules out of an airplane. And so it's better to have a plant, whatever it is, in that dead or that soil than nothing at all, because that's going to help stabilize the shoreline. It's going to help that accrete. If we don't have those plants there, you'll end up seeing the land actually start to decrease because it starts to decompose, and then you lose it. And then now that is a open water system. So
right, yeah, because those mangrove ecosystems, it's kind of a detritus-based food web, right? And that's how that land is preserved. Okay, so somebody's asking, we've talked about the mangrove research side of it, and I'm not sure if you've had any studies with this, but somebody asks, is there corresponding research going on somewhere regarding the ecosystems and the species, the impacts to salt marshes, if we're seeing a reduction in that habitat? Are there studies going on about that?
Yeah, there definitely are. And they kind of go hand in hand a little bit, because every time we do a mangrove project, you definitely have to have the salt marsh component of it to show what is happening in that salt marsh. There's actually a lot of work that's coming out of China right now, because they're seeing the opposite. They're seeing salt marsh overtake mangroves. And so what is happening to that ecosystem, and what are the mangroves losing when the salt marsh comes in? So salt marsh research happens all over the world, obviously, because it's, goes all the way up the Atlantic coast. And so it's a very small subset of data that comes out of Florida, but a lot of the stuff we draw from is from the Chesapeake area in terms of salt marsh productivity.
Okay, great. I just have a couple more questions for you here. Somebody's asking, do you see a possibility of mangrove swamps being expanded throughout all of the southern United States? So if we're going to start seeing it more, in regions that we've really never seen it before because of that changing climate, do you anticipate that?
It is definitely, there's a lot of research that is showing that at least in the Gulf states, there will be mangrove forests and not too far from now.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
And I want to leave off with this question. This person is coming to us from India, actually. So hello.
Oh, wonderful.
And they're asking, they want to know about any activities like mangrove propagation or mangrove nurseries, something promoting mangrove forests or the expansion or the conservation of such. Is there anything that maybe people can get involved with, just your everyday citizen, that you can get involved with to either help you with this research or help conserve mangroves?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of organizations in this area that have a big citizen science component to it and a lot of volunteer activities. And so it's not uncommon to see some sort of mangrove planting that they need volunteers to come out and be a part of. And when the volunteers come out and they're a part of something like this, we talk about the life history of the mangroves and what it's doing to the area where they live, the connectivity between mangroves and oysters and seagrasses. So there's the knowledge down here. I think that moving forward, it would be wonderful to have more living shorelines and more education to homeowners that we should definitely have mangroves in your backyard, on your seawall with a living shoreline. Because as I mentioned, did you see the difference in wave attenuation when a hurricane comes through? Would you like, that riprap behind your house, or do you want a mangrove behind your house? So there's some resources out there, but we definitely are a little bit behind the 8 ball, and hopefully over time we can kind of get the public on board with that. Mangroves are a good thing. We love them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think living shorelines is such a hugely impactful thing to talk about, especially in education circles, because I think it's something that generally, a member of the general public is not necessarily going to understand the basics of, but everything that it can do for things like erosion or for biodiversity, things like that. I hope that's the wave of the future. That's just my opinion. I hope that's the wave of the future. So, all right. Well, Loraé, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I thought it was really fascinating. It's amazing. I've taught, about mangroves for years, and I feel like every time I attend something like this, I learn something new. So thank you for that. If we did not have time to get to your questions this morning, please feel free to send us an email. Our email address is smseducation@si.edu, and Jamil will be putting that in the chat for you as well. And please feel free to sign up for some of our upcoming digital programs. Again, you'll be able to find all of the registration links on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/SmithsonianSMS. And you can also find that on our website as well. And let me go ahead and put this email address in the chat real quick. I'm also going to put our website address so that you can sign up for future events. So like I said, thank you again, Loraé. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm glad your brand new building is almost finished and ready to go there on the FOS campus. So
come down and visit. It's awesome.
Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait. All right. Thank you guys so much for attending, and hope to see you next time.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.